Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. North Country residents are giving the Postal Service an earful about planned cuts to get mail service out of the red. They worry about job losses and slower mail delivery times. Nationwide, the USPS may close 300 of 500 mail processing facilities, including the one in Plattsburgh. 65 people work at the facility. 20 jobs will be cut permanently. The rest will be moved to other plants or eliminated through attrition.
I built a new home here 3 years ago. My family is all here. My daughter's in school here. My son lives here. I'm going to be a grandparent soon. I'm not moving.
More ordinary material that used to be strictly in the mailbox moves to the internet. The amount of work we have to do changes.
The Postal Service is also considering closing the White River Junction facility in Vermont. Officials at the meeting said even though Burlington was also on that list, it's unlikely that both would be closed. Senator Sanders is proposing an amendment to the U.S. Constitution in hopes of reining in campaign spending by corporations and interest groups. In a landmark ruling 2 years ago, the Supreme Court said those entities have the same First Amendment free speech rights as individuals. The effect of the ruling is unlimited spending on political campaigns, and Sanders says that is endangering democracy. His amendment would limit free speech rights to individuals, ban corporate campaign donations to candidates, and give Congress and the states broad authority to regulate spending in elections.
But when the Supreme Court says that for purposes of the First Amendment, corporations are people, that writing checks from the company's bank account is constitutionally protected speech, and that even attempts by the federal government and states to impose reasonable restrictions on campaign ads are unconstitutional, when that occurs, our democracy is in grave danger.
There is no indication of broad support for Sanders' proposal, and amending the Constitution is no easy task. It requires approval from 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, and then it must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Well, the Vermont Youth Orchestra has a new executive director. Rosina Casanero will assume the post. Casanero also recently served as the program's associate manager for the Academy and has also worked at the Juilliard School and at the Whale Music Institute in New York City. Casanero is also a percussionist who has performed with the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. Some beautiful holiday music for you right there. A firefighter was killed Thursday in Worcester, Massachusetts, when part of a burning home collapsed on top of him. John Davies was a 17-year veteran of the force. He and his partner, Brian Carroll, rushed into the burning apartment building after hearing there was still someone trapped inside. As they searched the building, a wall collapsed and fell on top of them. Carroll was injured by the collapse, but is in stable condition. Students at Plymouth State College will be greeted by guns when they go to class today. 2 activists have announced that they may appear on campus with loaded weapons to protest the school's weapons policy. The school's president sent an email to students Thursday telling them they can stay home from classes if they want. Guns are not allowed on the college campuses in New Hampshire, but 2 men claim that that ban is unconstitutional. Lawmakers passed new income tax rates for New York. People earning more than $1 million a year will pay almost 2% more. Their state income rates will rise from 6.85% to 8.82%. But people earning less than $150,000 a year will see their taxes reduced by $200 to $400 a year. It's the first middle-class tax cut in New York in 50 years.
This is a jobs package that the state desperately needs to help turn around this economy. There's a fair tax plan that I think will make a dramatic difference.
Northern New York's legislative delegation is applauding the bill. Republican Senator Betty Little says the actions will move the economy forward rather than waiting and hoping the situation will improve. Assemblywoman Teresa Sayward pointed out the bill includes money for $50 million to aid in the recovery of tropical storms Irene and Lee for the North Country.
All right, well, coming up next, we open up the News Vault.
And we will introduce you to Vermont's Citizen of the Year.
Molly Smith joins us from our newsroom with more on this announcement. And Molly, what are political analysts saying it will take to defeat Governor Shumlin?
Well, Kagan, for one, it'll take a change in history. An incumbent governor has not been defeated in Vermont in more than half a century. But Brock says it's about time. He made the announcement at the State House Wednesday, backed by some of the big names in Vermont's GOP party. He spoke out about changes in energy policy policy, recovering from Irene, and criticized the Shumlin administration's effort towards single-payer health care, saying Vermonters do not want to be guinea pigs in a social experiment. Political analysts say he will need to run a positive campaign, raise a lot of money, and get his name out there.
I'm running for governor because I believe that this little state, filled with thousands of hardworking, independent, strong-willed people, can become an economic dynamo for New England and become the next great place to be.
This poll showed that when people were asked to give an impression, positive or negative, of Randy Brock, only about 36% could do so. So that means more than 60% of voters don't know enough about him to judge him favorably or unfavorably.
Brock's announcement comes during a presidential election year. Davis says these elections usually bring more people to the polls, but usually it's in favor of Democrats. Former Lieutenant Governor Brian Doobie issued a statement in support of Senator Brock, meaning he will not run for governor. Kagan?
All right, Molly Smith, thanks.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. I'm Molly Smith. U.S. forces have formally ended their mission in Iraq. They'll be all out of the country by December 31st. Soldiers rolled up the flag U.S. forces flew during the military campaign to mark the end of the nearly 9-year war. 4,500 Americans, including about 36 Vermont servicemen, died in the conflict. Last night on the Channel 3 News at 6, the commander of the Vermont National Guard, General Michael Doobie, reflected on the effort.
On the one hand, we paid a great price and a heavy sacrifice in Iraq, but on the other hand, we feel like we made a difference in setting the conditions. You know, Vermont made a difference in setting the conditions for a possible success in Iraq, and I think all Vermonters can be very proud of that fact.
General Doobie also says the recent decision to give the National Guard a seat at the Joint Chiefs of Staff table will give the 470,000 U.S. Guard members a greater voice in overseas deployments and in homeland security missions. Governor Shumlin has finalized his comprehensive energy plan. It calls for utilities to develop and invest in more wind, solar, and biomass with the goal of getting 90% of the state's energy from renewable sources by 2050. The plan includes some continued reliance on nuclear power, a part of the plan that environmental groups do not like. More than 200 students rallied yesterday at UVM to condemn a fraternity survey that posed a question about rape. Fed Up Vermont organized the rally. Members say the survey is just one example of a culture of sexism and sexual violence on campus. Meanwhile, the national body overseeing the SIGEP frat says there's no evidence that the survey was condoned by the local chapter, but the House has been ordered to cease all operation. Well, a long-awaited federal prison in Berlin, New Hampshire is taking applications for jobs. Senator Jeanne Shaheen says now the prison has received the funding it needs to open. It's posting jobs for local residents. They include correctional officers and registered nurses and other positions. Shaheen says Berlin Federal Prison will hire 329 people, 200 of them locally. The jobs are listed on federal and state employment websites. Hiring is expected to begin in February or March. Construction on the 1,300-bed facility was completed last year, but funding for operating the prison was not appropriated by Congress until last month. So we are sitting here with our fingers crossed for a white Christmas, and there's a glimmer of hope for next week, right, Sharon?
There's a glimmer of hope for next week, but
Good morning and welcome back. It's now 8:55. Well, he prompted a 5-day manhunt in central Vermont, and today he will be arraigned in Barry Court. Harley Breer is accused of assaulting a female family member. The 42-year-old Calais man eluded police earlier this month, but was eventually caught and arrested in a home in Tilton, New Hampshire. Breer has an extensive criminal record and served 8 years behind bars for kidnapping. Well, a man was found dead in his Shelburne home, and today police continue to search for clues. Family members say they went to check on the 70-year-old at his home on Penny Lane on Wednesday. He hadn't been seen since Sunday. The man's brother-in-law tells us it quickly was clear that something went terribly wrong.
So I went in and found JJ, and basically that was it. I just backed out and called the police and turned it over to them.
He was very quiet. He lived, by himself, and he never bothered anybody. I mean, he was just a very nice person.
Police have not released the man's name. They are calling his death suspicious. The man's brother-in-law says he saw a knife, but police would not comment on that. An Island Pond man is pleading not guilty to charges of making meth at his apartment. Police raided Carl Coker's residence in November and allegedly seized several items used in producing the drugs. Police say Coker admitted to cooking meth up to 15 times between April and his arrest. The 36-year-old also has an outstanding warrant from Alabama. He failed to complete a drug rehab program for distribution conviction in that state earlier this year. 10 New Hampshire hospitals are taking the stand in court today. The hospitals are suing the state. They claim New Hampshire is violating the Federal Medicaid Act by taxing hospitals 5.5% on net patient revenues while reducing payments for caring for the poor. The hospitals estimate they've been taxed $250 million over 2 years. Dartmouth-Hitchcock claims it has had to lay off staff to make up for those cuts in funding. A Fort Drum soldier was given a Heroism Award for helping rescue passengers from a tour bus engulfed in flames. Army Sergeant Jacob Perkins of Missouri was awarded the Soldier's Medal at a ceremony this week. It's one of the military's highest awards for non-combat act of heroism. Perkins was driving home on leave in July when he saw a bus and a tractor trailer engulfed in flames on the New York State Thruway. He ran into the bus several times to help remove injured passengers. The crash killed the truck driver and injured at least 50 others. Holiday vacations typically begin sometime next week for students at most schools, but that's not the case in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For students there, holiday vacation started this week. The district is one of the only of a handful across the country that now acknowledges the Muslim holiday known as the Festival of Sacrifice. The decision to add the holiday to the school calendar has drawn criticism from many. It's unknown how many Muslim students attend that district. Well, some residents of Keene, New Hampshire are being urged to stay indoors today. For a second straight day, the state's Department of Environmental Services is reporting unhealthy levels of air pollution in the part of the state. The DES says the pollution is likely coming from wood-burning stoves and boilers and is getting trapped near the ground. Anyone with heart or lung diseases such as asthma and bronchitis should stay indoors.
All right, well, everybody's still talking about the White Christmas. We've been saying it for several days now. Coming up next, there are some researchers who are identifying which parts of the region have the best chance of seeing a White Christmas.
Plus, we open up the news vault to remember a big celebration in Stowe.